Hello INTJ and friends, welcome back to another video. And today I'd like to discuss a little bit about careers and INTJ careers. So let's get right into the video. So I know a lot of you might be thinking, INTJs are usually pretty well thought out or long-term planners, so they probably already have this figured out. But I don't know if that's strictly true. I know for myself, I think the career aspect of life was not something that I was really entirely focused on, but rather more personal and life goals, which I ended up achieving, but left the career aspect to the side. So it made me think about what careers would fit nicely with the INTJ personality type. I know there's a lot of material out there on that, and I do advise that you check that out as well. But here are some of my thoughts on it, and I should probably start by talking about the dominant function of the INTJ, which is introvert intuition. Now, this makes them very good abstract thinkers and taking complicated subjects and making them understandable for a wide audience. And this doesn't happen all the time, because sometimes I think they can overanalyze and maybe make connections where connections should not be made, which ends up complicating things. So you want to try and find something that you can do where you can really exercise the best part of yourself, which is that introverted intuition, and also maybe have something that's a bit logically planned or logically developed because of your second function, which would be extroverted thinking. So jobs in those categories might be something like writing, which is what I do currently. Technical writing actually is what I was going to suggest. And I think that's very good because often you'll have to describe things or speak about things to an audience that might not understand that. And using your second slot function and your introvert intuition first slot function, you can sort of take those concepts and organize them in a way where people can understand what you're trying to say. I think one of the first things I ended up doing when it was actually the end of my university years, I was writing a book that was on cybersecurity, and I hadn't actually really been exposed to the subject a lot. But sort of the opportunity came, so I kind of took it. And I found that a very good learning experience, because organizing ideas, especially ones that you're not very comfortable with or don't really know that well, is a very good way to exercise that introvert intuition, because you're going to have to use what you already know and your past experiences and a bit of what I call the ether, which would be almost attaching yourself to some sort of unconscious collective and bringing ideas forth from there, and then using your second slot function to organize them. And I actually found the most appealing aspect of that was the design of the textbook itself. And the reason being, even though, which I'll get into a little bit later, the inferior function of a INTJ would be extrovert sensing, which I think you should try and avoid jobs like that. But the interesting thing about the INTJ and their fourth slot function is that although the extrovert sensing aspect of the INTJ means that they don't care much, let's say, about the external sense of the world, so they might not care too much about appearances or even aesthetics for that matter, but when it involves a personal project, it almost becomes an obsession. I know I think I suffer from this a bit, where sometimes they will be described as a perfectionist, and I think it's because when it becomes their own, again, personal project, they have a certain vision for it, and they want to carry out that vision, and if it's not exactly the way they envisioned it, then they'll sometimes become deflated or will scrap it and become demotivated to follow it. So I found the aesthetic part of design of the textbook one of my favorite parts, because it ended up becoming exactly the way I envisioned it to be. but it was a bit of a learning experience getting to that point. And actually, I'll go on a tangent here because I'm speaking about the extroverted sensing. One of the jobs I find, or one of the career paths, which I think, interestingly enough, might be an interesting one for the INTJ to follow, would actually be fashion design. And I say this with a pinch of salt because being SE inferior function, you'd imagine that they're not suited for this job at all. But I think if you turn that into a passion, it almost becomes overclocked, that inferior function, and it kind of melds well with your introverted intuition in the best case scenario. And being a job where sometimes it can be very solo focused, designing the textiles or the clothes, then it's maybe something you could consider. I think that might be a very small percentage of people, actually, or rather a very small percentage of INTJs who might be good at that. But I believe that if you're passionate about something, you should follow it. And again, like being introverted SE inferior, the opposite of the ESFP, who I believe were probably most adapt to fashion design because of their dominant function being the SE extroverted sensing. They'll be following trends. They'll be very in tune with that part of the sensory world. Not so much an INTJ. Although having said that, I think when it comes to fashion, trend breaking happens to be the thing that is what makes things fashionable. Bit of a contradiction there, but I think if you're out of the box, then you tend to work better there in that field. So those are two careers. One maybe that's a bit more obvious, the writing one, and the one that's a bit less obvious, which is the fashion design one. I'll get into a couple more actually right now because we're talking about the dominant functions. Introverted intuition. A good thing for an INTJ to do as well would be something like consulting or strategizing, strategy jobs, project management. And the reason for this is because, again, like the writing part, looking for inefficiencies particularly is something that we're probably pretty good at, or we are good at rather. And doing a consultancy type work means that the responsibility of the project's success doesn't actually rely on you. So you don't have to worry too much about the perfectionist aspect of carrying out the actual project, but rather you take on an advisory role, which I believe is very good for an INTJ. And if they are part of the team, it actually is a bit worse, because if you're part of that organization, you're part of a group or where you're consulting on, but it's also your, let's say, a stakeholder in that position, watching such a thing fail would be very bad for the functions, let's say, connections, and the way the mind works. But if you take on that backstep role and you kind of only advise on it, you can look for inefficiencies, and you can consult on where the certain project should go. It's in a project management sense. Now, if you're doing something like management consultancy, it's actually also pretty good, because I imagine the people element of it is not very personal. And you can look at a situation that's got, let's say, a team of people working for, let's say, a finance company or whatever. The idea of it being a finance company is almost irrelevant to the way that people are managed. And if you can use your introvert intuition and your secondary function of extrovert thinking to logically assess the gaps within the management or the management of the people, then it's a very valuable thing for the who would be the owner or the CEO or the people or the management team of that organization. I actually did some consultancy myself, and I found it to be very enlightening in that sense, because it was very good to be able to look for those patterns and advise on those. And that brings me into another section or another path, which I think is another one that people might not think about being INTJs, but I believe they would be pretty good at this, is stuff like life coaching. And the reason I say this is, although they might not be as good as an INFJ because they're more feeling orientated and will be able to connect more on an emotional level with the person they're trying to advise, I think the INTJ, being ruthless in their efficiency, will advise people, or the person who they're coaching essentially, to take a course of action that will almost certainly work for them. Now, you obviously have to find a type of person who you could coach that would be receptive to this kind of advice and counsel, because in the way the INTJ is ruthless in their mind of clearing out inconsistencies, it can come across as insensitive to other people. So this is also one of the reasons I think INTJs are viewed as cold people, even though the way they care for people and things are just different. And I think that can be very valuable to someone who is looking for that type of help. So those are a few ways that you can use your dominant functions to find a career that really fits or melds with you. And again, as I said before, if you're passionate about something, you should follow it regardless, because I think the beautiful thing about INTJs is that they will always try and interject their personality into what they're doing. This is why I can be very obsessive over the design of something and the way it looks, even though traditionally we're SE inferior, which means we're not actually too much connected to that kind of thing. But when it becomes our baby, let's say, then it's almost, paramount to the success of the project. Now, having said that, there are certain things that you could avoid, or maybe should avoid, and that is to do with your SE inferior. So things of the nature, or again, design where you don't care too much about the way a thing looks, then maybe it's not for you. Also, because of the fact that they're so attached to their personal projects, I'll give you an example. I was doing logo design. I do like design. I think it's a very interesting career path, and it can be very creative. The problem being that clients sometimes do not like what you make, and they'll make suggestions, and at the end of the day, it's their logo, so you have to make what they want. But when you can see something that's obviously wrong, you can't say, no, you should have it this way, because essentially they're paying for a product, right? So there's a bit of let's say, a clash there, which would be best avoided. I believe as an INTJ, it's not a great thing to focus too heavily on the SE type jobs like design or aesthetics, or maybe even physical stuff like construction or what have you. And that's also another thing to mention, is the third slot function, or your blind spot, the introverted feeling. This will develop later on. So I think if you're in the early stages of life and you're thinking about a career path, then maybe one-on-one type advisory positions would be good to develop that function a bit, because then you can start to understand other people's emotions and understand them and yourself in different environments. But it's not something that we're probably going to be great at unless we use it in a more recreational way. Oh, pardon me. So yeah, those are the jobs that I would consider an INTJ, being good at. And try and think of it yourself as well, in terms of how you can exercise your dominant function and your secondary function and utilize or leverage the strength of that in your career. Being INTJs, I gather you're probably already pretty far ahead in terms of what you want to do. But again, like myself, I found myself focusing on more life-orientated goals or personal goals rather than a career one. And I do find myself jumping between things because I never found, or rather, I had a general idea of what I was looking for, but I couldn't really find a way to exercise it. So I hope that helps, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye now.